Hi everyone, this is the third and final video for section 8.3 on multiplying and dividing integers. So we ended the last video with talking about multiplication. So the thing that we established at the very end of the video was this really important property. Clean this up a bit. This really important property that -1 times -1 is 1. And so this is what we're going to call one of our sign rules for multiplication. Just means that if you have a pair of negatives, they cancel out, is all that this says. And this is something we know and that we're very familiar with. So all of these sign rules that we have for multiplication are also going to be the same for division. And why is that? Well, because division of integers is just the same thing as division of whole numbers, right? We've seen that a lot in this chapter, that all of our operations for integers are just the same thing we had for whole numbers. So division of integers is the same thing as division of whole numbers. And we defined division of whole numbers back in chapter 3 in terms of multiplication. And so we said back in chapter 3 that b divided by n is the number a, if and only if a times n is b, where n is non-zero. And so because we define division in terms of multiplication, everything works in the same way. So if you remember in chapter 3, we didn't have a lot to say about division because we could think of division as repeated subtraction or this kind of inverse operation to multiplication. So again, we don't have a lot to say about it here. Just because I know you know how to divide integers, so just make sure that you know that all the sign rules hold for division in the same way they hold for multiplication. So, like I just mentioned, the sign rule that we established last time was that -1 times -1 was just equal to +1. And that's the rule that we established last time. So now we're going to add some others. So the first one is that whenever we take -1 and multiply it by an integer, we just get the opposite of that integer. And keep in mind here that I'm not saying negative a, because we're defining this for any integer a. So a could already be positive or negative. This is something we talked about, I think in 8.1. Whenever we started talking about negative numbers, that it may be more clear to students if you say opposite. So we're going to say that if we multiply -1 times any integer a, you just get the opposite of that integer. It just changes the sign. So if a was negative, it becomes positive, and if a was positive, it becomes negative. Okay? And so we can combine this property with the multiplication that we know to say if we have any integers a and b, then when you multiply the opposite of an integer times another number, it just becomes the opposite of the product. And this can also extend the other way. So all we're saying here is if we have the opposite of an integer times another integer, you just get the opposite of the original product. And so it doesn't matter if that opposite is in the first thing you multiply or the second thing you multiply. So this is the same thing as a times the opposite of b. So all of these things are the same. And so all this is saying is that whenever you multiply any integers, you really can just disregard the negative sign and put it out in front of the product, which is what we do all the time. Right? It's what we do all the time whenever we operate with things, is that we can just pull the negative out in front. And you can see that this property really just comes directly from the one above. Because if we have -a, or the opposite of a, times b, well, the property above tells us this is -1 times a times b. And if we just rewrite things a little bit, this is negative times the product of AB. So you can see that it just follows directly from the thing above it. And all of these things work in the way we expect them to. So yeah, so this is how it goes. So these are the properties. And so these properties can connect addition and multiplication in a really nice way. And it's because whenever we look at these properties of multiplying integers, we deal a lot with negatives. But if you remember that whenever we dealt with negatives, these negative things were really, we called them opposite in this chapter, but in chapter 3, I believe, in chapter 3, we called them additive inverses. So we can say that an opposite is the same thing as an additive inverse. So an opposite is the same thing as an additive inverse. So this is where we can see that -1 times a number is just the opposite of that number. And we can use inverses to also kind of flip between operations. So these properties tell us that subtracting a number is just adding the opposite of that number. So subtracting is just adding the opposite of whatever number you're subtracting. So when we talked about adding and subtracting integers in 8.2, we had the problem a lot where we were dealing with something that looked like 3 plus -4. And you were told not to convert that to 3 minus 4. Because yes, we know that that's true, but it may not be clear to students yet. If they don't know this property, it may not be clear to them that this is actually the same thing as 3 minus 4. So using this property that -1 times a number is just the opposite of that number can tell us what we need to know. So we can see that 3 plus -4 is really the same thing as 3 plus -1 times 4, which is just the same thing if we put the negative in the operation here as 3 minus 4. And so this is where we can finally talk about putting the negative sign as a minus sign instead of a negative sign. And that we were really clear about these two things are different. But now we can go between them because of these properties. Okay, the last property that we have is what we call the cancellation property. So we have that if we have a, b, and c where c is non-zero as integers, if we have a times c equals b times c, then we can cancel the c in this equation and just say that a equals b. So this is what is called right cancellation. And that's just because the c is on the left. Oh, right, I'm sorry. AC equals BC. The c is on the right. So these things being equal tells us that a equals b. And similarly, we have a left cancellation where CA equals CB, again implies that A equals B. So you can cancel from the right and from the left. Okay, and these are all the properties that we have for multiplying and dividing integers. So keep in mind, again, so division, all of the division properties also hold. So I'll just kind of formalize that right quick. So what are the three properties that we have? Well, we have that -1 times -1 equals 1. Well, in division form, we just divide. -1 divided by -1 is 1. We also have that -1 times a is minus a. So we can say this implies that instead of multiplying a by -1, if we do a divided by -1, we get negative a. And then lastly, we have negative a divided by b equals negative a divided by b equals a divided by negative b. And these are how those properties relate to division. Okay, so that's all that I had to say on multiplying and dividing integers. So that's all for this section and this video.